It says that it's live on YouTube on your screen, but it's not yet loaded up, so I'll let you know.
Thank you, Barb.
Okay, we are live. Lisa, I would just say if you're ready, we don't have all staff here yet, but I'll continue to let them in as we go along. I believe we can start the meeting.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge that yesterday we started the Teacher Appreciation Week, and it's a very special week every year, but I think this year in particularly, I think it's yeah, I think I can share a much greater appreciation for all our teachers. And in that spirit, I wrote a poem that I'd like to offer to all MSD teachers, but also educators everywhere. Dear teachers, we moved from the classroom to Zoom. We moved to your living room. We struggled, we made mistakes, but we still love you. You became learners so we can have instruction. You reinvented instruction so we can still be at school. We asked of you a considerable amount of creativity and innovation during a time of world crisis. We asked of you to reimagine education while witnessing unprecedented times. We have asked you to be superhumans, caring for your families and our families during a time of extreme uncertainty. We have asked of you to trade in-person connections to virtual ones, hallway conversations to Zoom check-ins, office passes to emails, and in the midst of frozen cameras, low connectivity, and innovative virtual backgrounds, you persisted, doing the best that you can always. You are showing up for our students, for our families, and for our communities. You are redesigning education, and for all of that, we thank you. So I hope I did justice on behalf of all of us.
That was great. Thank you so much, Ananda, that was beautiful.
Thank you for letting me be the conduit of such important appreciation. So moving on to our agenda, next is I move to approve the minutes dated March 2nd. You want to get a second?
Yep, I got a second. Gloria, second.
Nikki, Gloria, Anika, your advisory vote.
Aye.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Meetings passed. Thank you. 7-0.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Next, we are going to have some updates and a discussion around Title I, health education and sexual assault mandated reporting. I know that all those topics are very important and for some of us very close to our personal and professional lives. So I ask that as Lisa are going through the presentation that you just take notes of your questions or considerations. If you have questions about a particular document that is linked to a particular slide, that you remember which slide it was and the name of the document so we can easily know what document you're referencing to. After those 3 presentations, we're gonna pause. We'll have a moment to reflect on what could be something helpful for the team and then answer any questions. And then we're gonna move into the BAP policies and some recommendations for adjustment in different parts of the reporting. I'm gonna check in to see if are there any questions about how we're gonna proceed our meeting? So hearing none, Lisa, thank you so much to you and your team for putting this together. And then whenever you're ready, just go for it.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So we have a team of folks from the Teaching and Learning Department here with us tonight. We're going to be talking about the proactive and educational work that we're doing around Title IX and mandatory reporting. And we're also going to be talking about how we respond and react when things happen and what kind of training and supports we provide for school staff. Then we will end up the presentation with a summary of our BEP policy revisions and have a discussion and gain some feedback around that. So tonight we have with us Eric Keston, our Affirmative Action Officer, Title IX Investigator and Contract Compliance Coordinator. Ashley Riley is here, our FIED Health and Wellness Coordinator. Gina Agulia is here, our Coordinator of Cross Systems and Critical Response. Bryn Martina is here, our Coordinator of Progressive Discipline. And Jay Affeld is here, our Executive Director of Student and Staff Supports. And I will drive the presentation so folks can do the presentation to the board. So I'll move the slides along.
Great. So this is Eric Keston, and I'll be starting with tonight. You can just move to the next couple slides, Lisa, if you like. And I'll be starting with just an overview of Title IX, which is the federal law. And this is the part, well, the whole law is rather lengthy. This is the part that is pulled out, which says that on the basis of sex, people can't be excluded from participation, denied benefits of, or subjected to any discrimination in an educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Every public school district across the country falls under that category. And as I'm speaking tonight, you might hear me say male and female. Under the current administration, at the federal level, sex is defined as binary, male and female. With the previous administration, it was a broader definition, which included gender identity, but technically that's not how this current administration defines sex under Title IX. So Title IX at the federal level is just restricted to that. Next slide, please. And so, but that being said, in the district, Title IX complaints in the district apply whenever a person believes they're treated differently and the action can be related to someone's gender and gender identity. So while federal law doesn't apply to gender identity at the moment, we're still using the same process if it comes up for someone's gender or gender identity. And the requirement, the enforcement part of the law falls under the district's is captured through the district's non-discrimination policy. Next slide, please. So this is where Title IX would apply, and again, it's related to sex discrimination. There's harassment and discrimination. Harassment is quid pro quo, is the idea that someone will go to a student and give you better grades, I'll do this, I'll do that, or a staff member, I'll give you a promotion or raise, or the classroom you want, if you do this for me. Sexual assault, violence, I think is self-explanatory. Hostile environment is the concept that an environment becomes so severe, so pervasive, so the harassment so persistent that someone can no longer really process in the space. Retaliation occurs when somebody has filed a complaint, made a complaint regarding around sex harassment or discrimination, or participated, like been a witness in, and then someone's taking action against them because of that. And then discrimination, obviously it said sex, gender identity. Program equity is the concept of, a lot of times it's thought of in Title IX around athletics, but it also, in athletics, it's around the opportunity for males and female students. And then, but it also goes towards different classes, and not specific class, but like advanced learning or different opportunities in that way is where that would fall. Next slide, please. So again, Title IX addresses sexual harassment, discrimination by teachers, other employees, students, third parties coming to our spaces. We have a responsibility as a district to take prompt, effective action once we know about it. Next slide, please. So it applies when we have control over the alleged bad actor, whether it's a student, staff, etc., and the circumstances, school trip, school property, anything like that. When both of those two things happen, that's when it specifically applies. Although what's come up often in my time being here, and this is my 6th year in the district, is where it says at the bottom of that slide, downstream effects. So what's come up before is you'll have 2 people that are friends. It's summertime, they're hanging out at someone's house, and someone assaults one student assaults the other student. We have no control over that as far as disciplining the student, but they come back to school, we're made aware of it, and sometimes what has happened is like both students will be in the same class and a sitting chart sitting next to each other. Under those circumstances, like I said, we can't discipline the bad actor. However, we do have a responsibility to try and still support the student, the other student. And so that's when we might have a responsibility to do something if it happens and falls over into the school. Next slide, please. So under federal law, federal guidance, our obligation is when we become aware of a complaint, we're supposed to investigate it. We're supposed to stop the action from occurring, prevent it from occurring again, and then we're supposed to remedy it and with supports. Next slide. One of the differences between Title IX and other investigations, and this slide and the very next slide, are from federal guidance. Because Title IX is a federal law, and everything we do with Title IX is totally, we're following the federal law. So one of the differences is when we become aware of situations, we have to consider something called interim measures, and that's measures to support the reporting party during the course of the investigation. Depending on what is determined in the course of the investigation, these measures may stay in place, they may change, they may go away, it kind of depends. So these are factors that the federal government says to consider. They're not all inclusive, but it's including what the reporting party asks for, the age of students involved, the specific allegations. What are some things we could do in the same classroom, same recess time, and how it plays out is very fact specific. And it could look like putting kids who are sharing a class, maybe separating them within the class or different classes. And what always is put in mind is we have to minimize the burden on the reporting party and should inconvenience the alleged perpetrator if we're taking steps. If you go to the next slide, please. And continue with the interim measures. These are examples that are from federal guidance, and such as providing services to the reporting party, different seating, schedules, assignments. One thing I'll say is, and I have this on here again about minimizing the burden to the reporting party. Using the alleged perpetrator language is sometimes difficult language, but the reason that is there is that is the language that's used across the board in federal guidance. And so that's where since that's where this came from, that's the language that's used there. When I do trainings and talks around it and support people, we still talk about not letting that bias a particular investigation. Now, at the end of the investigation, assuming a violation is found, this is our further responsibility under federal law. We have to take steps regarding the impact to support the reporting party and take steps also for the responding party, though Title IX really focuses on the reporting party and supporting that person so that anything that's happened to someone, they can continue to be successful in school going forward. Create a support plan. And something else that's very important, along with the interim measures under federal law, is we have to do check-ins with the reporting party or target and the family to monitor the investigations. And they want us to do check-ins at 30 days and 90 days. And the idea of the check-in is, since we've taken steps to help them still be successful in school, we have to actually check back in as a district and make sure that's working. This all happens for the most part at the school level. And so when the support plan is put in place, what I always recommend what schools generally do is they identify a trusted staff member at the school, usually someone from student services, principal, assistant principal, to work with that family. And of course, always document everything so we can follow up with it as necessary. And then this is just general additional information around Title IX. The federal government has created new Title IX regulations. They created over a year ago. They went through a comment period. They have not been released yet. I don't know what the final ones look like. The Office of Civil Rights Department of Education, my understanding from the last article I saw is they've gone to the White House and been approved. There are some people based on the current with COVID-19 asking that they don't release them yet. Once they're released, my understanding is, the rumor on the street is there's going to be a lot of requirements for K-12, and there'll be requirements that we have to have a deadline by the time we have to make those changes. I don't know specifically what they are or what the deadline is, but that will impact, it may impact some of what I just said to you. In addition to that, I'm always doing ongoing training and support. So for those who don't know, I'm in the Legal Services Department. Every year, the Legal Services Department does a conference in August, generally in August, for principals and assistant principals, all of them across the district. 4 of the last 5, I have done a specific training on Title IX, so all the schools know their responsibilities. I've also gone trainings for student services staff at different schools. I do a lot of support around this and talk to staff who are doing investigations all the time to help support them, help them figure out the best steps to do. Guardian is something that will be coming online at some point next year. And what that is a database to help us specifically track Title IX complaints. Title IX liaisons is something that was created a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. And what that is even if I'm the friendliest, most approachable person in the world, hypothetically, I'm still far away and separated at Doyle. And so we want to know what's happening, and we want students to have someone they can talk to. So the idea of a Title IX liaison is a person has been identified at each middle school and high school, most often student services, sometimes assistant principals, and they're getting special training. They've had a training each of the last 2 years that I've done with Rape Crisis Center. Bryn has been part of that training to help bring people on and help them be a soft landing and support these students in the building. And as it says, besides this Title IX liaison training, I've also done other trainings throughout the years I've been in the district with the Rape Crisis Center. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric.
All right, now moving to health education. As Lisa said, Ashley Riley, Fight Health and Wellness, and I'm going to talk about some preventative measures that have been put in place to talk about consent and sexual assault for health education. The first step, about a year ago, we revised the 4K through 12 Human Growth and Development Progression of Learning. This document identifies skills-based instruction around topics relating to understanding bodies, identity, healthy relationships, ally behavior, and personal safety. So within personal safety, concepts that are developmentally appropriate around boundaries, unwanted or unsafe touches, consent, privacy, power dynamics, etc., are in those learning outcomes. And specifically, as far as curriculum and instructional resources, we have second step that is in grades K through 3 currently right now in the Child Protective Unit. And then rights, respect, responsibility is another curriculum that is used for other grade levels that have lessons around consent. Next, this last Welcome Back week for 1920, we had secondary health education teachers come together for professional learning, and the topic was around building consent culture in the classroom, where we had GSAFE, Ali, the executive director of GSAFE, come in and present around consent culture. And there we were able to provide educators with concrete examples of different activities that they could do with students to talk about consent. And then during that professional learning session, we also had time for teachers to connect around learning more about the Title IX liaisons in the buildings, learning about just different rights that students have and staff have around Title IX, And then just making sure that we're providing instruction that students are aware of who their liaison is in their building and what and why they may reach out to that person. This third step is increasing connections with community partners. So currently we have guest speakers come into classrooms, including Rape Crisis Center, G-Safe, DAYS, and also the district collaborates with the Sexual Reproductive Health Alliance of Dane County to make sure that we have our students connected to community resources, but then also making sure that our curriculum resources are up to date and align with the professionals in the community. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that we're increasing student voice in specifically high schools right now, but trying to move towards middle schools a little bit more next year, but trying to gain input from students on how and what their experiences are around human growth and development, sexual education, and specifically around consent. And so far the groups that we've been working with a little bit more closely is Memorial, East, La Follette's Gender Equity Associations, and then also West High School's Empower Hour. And again, just trying to understand kind of what kids are needing, what their experience, and how we can continue to better our curriculum. Thanks.
Okay, so my name is Gina Agulia. I'll be talking about sexual assault mandated reporting, both preventative and some responsive stuff that we're doing. Ashley alluded to the Child Protection Unit, which is part of our second step curriculum. It is currently in grades K through 3, but next year we'll be adding grades 4 and 5. So we're excited that it'll be available for students grades K through 5. Each grade receives 6 lessons, and the lessons really revolve around protective behaviors. They are focused on identifying unsafe situations, unwanted and unsafe touches, and as you can see that little picture right there, focus on how to recognize that something's unsafe, how to refuse it or say words that mean no, and then how to report it. So that's the first step that a lot of our students get around recognizing safe and unsafe situations. And it's really the foundation for teaching more about consent, physical and sexual abuse, establishing assertiveness, stuff like that. And then as Ashley said, with our health curriculum continues on past 5th grade. Next. Something else that we have been working on this year in MMSD is creating an overview of all the different ways that we are putting documentation together around prevention and response to sexual violence in schools. This is now part of our district-wide safety plan, and it is connected to the behavior education plan, and it has an overview of all of our community partnerships, our MOAs, and everything that you're going to hear about today is all connected into that overview. Then we also have a more specific detailed guidance, and that is something that we created specifically for school staff, and even more specifically for administrators, really to help them be grounded in decision making when they need to make a decision around a potential incident of sexual assault. We have trained our principals, assistant principals, student services staff, which consists of psychologists, social workers, counselors, and nurses, and then also our school security assistants in this detailed guidance. And then the next slide has a little bit more information on the detailed guidance. The reason, again, even though this is a little bit more detailed, this is still an overview of the guidance. But the idea behind it, like I said, is really to help administrators know what to do first, which is to make sure they're reaching out to the appropriate people, taking the critical first steps, and also making sure that anybody in the school knows to involve an administrator right away when they have reason to believe there is a sexual assault on campus or that a sexual assault on campus has been reported. Go ahead, next slide. Because we're talking about sexual assault, it's very important that we also talk about mandated reporting. So every staff at MMSD is a mandated reporter. This is this means that if they suspect that there is abuse or neglect going on, that they are required to make a report. We do encourage staff to consult with student services or student support staff, specifically social workers or administrators, even though we always tell them that consultation cannot delay a report. So we want people to connect and talk about what might be going on for a student, but we also want to make sure they know that they are required to make those reports if they suspect child abuse or neglect. The protocol that's linked in that first bullet there is a protocol that was done in collaboration with CPS, with Child Protection Services, a group of social workers and staff from across the county, not just MMSD, but other school districts as well, got together to create that protocol. The protocol is, the first page is focused on just, it's meant to be a support, has phone numbers that are helpful for staff to have, both district level as well as our like county-wide numbers. The next page is a, oh, sorry, I meant on the protocol, just trying to share a little bit more about the protocol. So still on the slide before this one, it has guidance around what to do as a staff member. It has the Board of Education policy around mandatory reporting. It also goes into types of maltreatment and then has a CPS follow-up flow chart. And so all those things really are important because they help the staff member that is making the report just think about like how, like what needs to go into making a report. What are the cultural implications? Are they making sure that they have the that they're just using the facts, that they know what the definitions of maltreatment are, and that they're thinking critically about their own individual biases. And again, that's a big reason why we want, if possible, for people to connect with school social workers because they are trained in child protection laws and policies. So we want to make sure that if it's possible, that they are staying connected. The last thing down there, just one more link, and that is around a decision-making tree around sexually students that are in sexual contact, not necessarily students that there's sexual assault, because again, there is a difference when we're thinking about consent versus not consent. So that's another decision-making tree that's really helpful for staff. Okay, next slide. When we are having to make a mandated report around sexual assault, it's really important for people to know that if you're going to make a report to CPS, it will likely get screened to law enforcement. CPS deals with caregiver abuse and assault, and if the yeah, obviously, if the assault involves a caregiver, then CPS and law enforcement will be working together. But if it involves a non-caregiver, then it would get screened to law enforcement. We always want to make sure that when students are making reports that we inform them of confidentiality and information sharing. A phrase we use often is that we'll need to tell another trusted adult to keep you safe. So it's really important that students know that even though we want to make sure that they're disclosing something very personal, very serious, but at the same time that we might need to be sharing it with someone else to make sure that they are in fact safe. Because of this, there might be some situations where we make a decision of whether or not to involve CPS or law enforcement right away. And again, that's why it's so important for student services staff or social workers to be connected and support around that. We also have lots of community partners that I know our school social workers and other support staff work really closely with, and they're, they make up a lot of the support within our buildings, like the Rape Crisis Center, DAYS, and Safe Harbor, to ensure that the right next steps are taken for students. On specific situations, we have a variety of different possibilities that can happen. Obviously, nothing happens in a vacuum, and there's always a lot of different things that happen. But when thinking about student disclosing something that's happened on campus, there needs to be an assessment for immediate safety, and then we need to contact the administrator as soon as possible. If a student discloses something that was a past situation or it was off campus, Eric kind of alluded to that earlier, we again would assess immediate safety, but then potentially offer support to listen if appropriate, and then as soon as possible contacting that student support staff for next steps. As always, with key considerations, it's important to note the staff member that's receiving the information, making sure that we are involving family when it's appropriate, making sure that we are abiding by all confidentiality and information sharing, and also taking into consideration cultural implications. Follow-up always will be setting up a plan for support and safety with both at school and then with community partners, trusted adults, or support staff and family outside of school. And as we know, the best approach to sexual assault prevention is to create a school culture of consent and respect. So that's really important to teach kids about safe and healthy relationships as soon and as early as possible. And our team question is, how can the board work with the district leaders and school teams to help establish and maintain a school culture of consent and respect in all of our schools?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina and Ashley, and thank you again, Eric. Before we engage into this question, I am curious if you can, maybe I'm gonna call in order that how you all presented, how your body of work is showing up in a virtual world. And Eric, can you start talking about that? Like, what's happening? What is the problem of practice? How is Title IX showing up virtually for you? What is opportunities? What it might be a problem that we gonna have to figure it out? Or what are some of the things that are working really well or that have translated well?
So thank you for the question. I would say that much of Title IX and how it's come up is people in the buildings in contact with each other. So by obviously the touching and the things of that nature, so by virtue of the virtual environment, it's gone down quite a bit. And frankly, I haven't heard much of anything since we've gone back to school. And I know, I didn't say this before, I have a middle schooler and a high schooler in the district myself. And I know for the most part, through their activities at 8th grade, 11th grade, they're not even really interacting with other students except their friends that they normally interact with. So they're not even the way, at least in their classes or teachers are teaching, they're not engaging with other students. Ways that it might come up is if kids are using school property or emails and stuff like that to somehow harass other kids. So that could point to making kids aware of when that's a problem, that there's places they can go to respond to that. And that reminds me, one of the things I did forget to mention is, besides training for staff, I've done a lot of work over the years with students. I've presented to different high school classes around Title IX, and I've presented to a number of groups around that. And so maybe that kind of thing, just so kids are aware that it could be a problem. In general, it hasn't, and it makes sense because, again, most of what we're talking about would be kids touching, being in contact with the close physical contact with each other.
Thank you, Eric. And you said that you have, I got you, Nikki, hold on. When you said that you have a training that's scheduled in August, is the training still happen? Is it gonna happen virtually?
So that's a great question. And I think that's still under process of what it's gonna look like, depending on where the world is in Wisconsin at that time. But so that's a legal services conference where the legal services team presents around different issues, which would include Title IX. What we've already talked about is recording those presentations so that if we are a live environment or a Zoom environment, we can still play them later. And even if we're in person, like if this wasn't happening, we've already talked about the idea of recording it so it could be shown later. But if it ends up being completely virtual, then we've already started having those discussions about what it would look like. So yes, it will go forward regardless of where we're physically located at the time.
Thank you, Eric.
Ashley,
Ashley, thank you. Can you talk a little bit, Ashley, about how we're supporting our teachers and our staff in regards to health ed in the virtual world?
Yeah, so the high schools curriculum, looking at what's essential moving forward, most of the high schools hadn't yet gotten to human growth and development, sexual health, and healthy relationships. So We have bi-weekly meetings with the high school health teachers right now, where we're kind of just collaborating and kind of seeing what we're all doing as far as online instruction. So high schools kind of, other than reducing curriculum and load on students, it's the content as far as consent hasn't really changed. I know that coming shortly should be a video or like a Zoom recording from RCC. So normally Rape Crisis Center comes into a lot of our schools to present, and I believe they are creating a presentation that we can still share out with students, even though it's different. And then for middle school, I would say that's where some questions were raised, like where if some of the content around human growth and development without a direct instructor there, how that would look. And there were some questions, but I will say that when the teachers came together, so middle school teachers also have been meeting bi-weekly, and they have said that consent, out of a lot of the topics with human growth and development, that's one for sure they're focusing on. So that was awesome to hear that that was kind of the plan going forward, because that is something that we'll have to consider depending on how things move forward as far as human growth and development instruction in younger grade levels as well, because we want to make sure that there's adults there present and able to answer questions and things like that when kids are learning.
Thank you, Ashley. And Gina, thank you so much for your presentation. In the world of sexual assault, what is, how is it showing up virtually, especially because we know that the going in virtual instruction has limited the contact between social workers and students, and what are you seeing? What is a foreseeable opportunities for us?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. We have seen lots of articles and news reports and everything around just the concern around children being home more and what that potentially looks like. We also know that when mandated reports are made, the two top reporters are educators and doctors, and we know that kids are not in school or regularly going to their doctors right now. So there is that bit of concern. So what we've done so far is made sure that I've been pretty closely connected to CPS, making sure that we're both in alignment with how our reporting process is going to go. We've decided it's going to remain constant, the same that it has been. We then made sure that principals in the principal bulletin got information around reporting requirements. We give out a little mini presentation in the protocol at the beginning of every year, but we resent them out just as reminders around best practices for mandated reporting. And then specifically for sexual assault, where like we said earlier, especially for our younger grades, the child protection unit is a really great curriculum, because it does talk about safe and unsafe touches, wanted and unwanted touches, and really starts to talk about how to recognize when something doesn't feel safe or isn't wanted. And so I know a lot of our social workers are recording themselves and continuing to deliver some of those lessons, or sending them to their teacher teams so that we can have some of that. But we're going to continue to push into other options around additional ways to have some lessons available virtually.
Thank you so much for that, Gina. And I'm gonna open to Lisa before I open to everyone. Lisa, is there anything else you'd like to add before we take questions from board members?
Thanks, Ananda. No, I think that this is a really thoughtful and collaborative team, as I think you can see. And I think they are certainly ready to answer and give feedback based on the other questions that the board members have at this time.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. So we're gonna go Nikki, Chris, and Ali. Nikki, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Barb, Lisa, can you take out the screen share so it's easier for me to see everyone's questions and
Oh,
it's easier
yep,
for,
you got it.
thank you.
Um,
Okay, go ahead, Nikki.
my question for Eric is on the Guardian system, the database that you mentioned of keeping track, when does that start? It isn't mandated.
Thank you for the question. So it's something that we purchased a few months ago, and we were in the process of training. I trained one of the high schools with it, and the vendor trained one of the high schools, and we were going to be rolling it out with that high school this second semester. Because what it does is it has steps, how to do the investigation. Everything's included in there. So we're going to roll it out with the one school first to make sure it works and meets their needs and helps us gather and guide through, so we're meeting all the federal guidance. And then the plan was to do that right now, during this time period, and then roll it out next year to the high schools, and then expand it beyond that. So we're gonna do the slow thing to make sure we had it right before it went to everybody. We haven't discussed yet what the current circumstances, if that's gonna change that yet or not. So that'll be a conversation I have with Sherry.
Yes. I'm just worried about FERPA or civil rights violations in certain situations, especially on students with disabilities who may have certain safety risks.
So yeah, that totally aware, totally agree, and we're very aware of that and of those concerns and it's factored in. So the database is just like the people who have access to it will be the ones who are actually doing the related investigation, and there's levels of permission. So like I can see whatever would go in there, but if I was a assistant principal in a school who's doing the investigation, I could only have access to the actual investigation I've been assigned to, not to even any other investigations in the system itself.
That's good to know. And then you stated there's detailed guidance for sexual assault for administrators. Are we set that as well? Can the board
guidance,
set that?
so the guidance I was referring to was federal law.
Okay.
They've got tons of guidance out there for Title IX.
And my last question is I know that some of the sexual assault and complaints have been down on Zoom bombing, though. Have we had any increase in harassment because of Zoom bombing or people harassing other people who aren't supposed to be in the rooms?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of it happening either from schools or from other people at central office who have become aware of it, or principals or anybody. So I've not heard of that happening yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nikki. Chris Caruzzi.
Ananda, is the background noise too bad right now? It's piano night in my house.
You're fine.
Okay, good. I just had some questions and comments specifically around the section on sexual assault and mandated reporting. And my first comment was about the second step curriculum. It sounds like a really good curriculum, but I do have, I just wanted to get some clarification on the portion of the curriculum that's focused on refusal skills. I think a good consent curriculum will, of course, encourage kids to be assertive, but we have to get away from the notion that consent involves refusal and move kids to understanding that consent is the presence of a freely given yes, not the absence of a no. And so I just want to make sure that, you know, when I saw that little graphic that went with the second step curriculum and I saw the emphasis on like saying no loud and clear, even though I know that kind of fits with Wisconsin's legal definition of consent, that's not a good definition of consent. And I hope we're also teaching kids the notion, you know, the idea that consent is a freely given yes, and silence doesn't imply consent. I don't know if, should I just keep going or wait for a response to that?
Do you want me to respond to that?
I'm sure, yeah.
Go ahead, Gina.
I agree with you. I think that that refusal and consent are different things. And the curriculum, I have taught it myself as a elementary school social worker, and it definitely is developmentally appropriate for that grade level to really see like the different things that are unsafe, and to slowly to be able to, you know, use words that mean no, and it kind of moves chronologically towards more of the idea around consent. But again, yeah, obviously we would want to be teaching consent along with recognizing, refusing, and reporting. And I know that that is something that we're bringing into our health curriculum. So it's kind of a double dose. The child protection unit is not just focused around sexual assault. It's focused on all unsafe behaviors. There's a really fun song that you can look up around the different safety rules. But it is around safety. And so there is a component that does involve safe and unsafe touches and wanted and unwanted touches. But it is definitely around safety. So the consent, we're really definitely bringing in our health curriculum.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. The rest of my comments are about the document that was attached to the slide after the second step slide. It was the slide that was titled, "What are we doing in MMSD?" And it's the document on preventing and responding to sexual violence in schools. And I just had a few comments on that one. My first one was about training that staff are receiving. I'm really glad you're getting like in-depth training to staff who might be the main responders to an incident of sexual assault or sexual violence. However, I think it's also important that every staff person in our schools gets some level of training in consent and what that means and how to teach it. If someone's been sexually assaulted or is experiencing other kinds of sexual violence, they're going to go to whoever in the school feels safest to them. And for that reason, even though the response of that person might be to get the student to someone who can really provide them the services they need to have some initial training in what consent is and also how to talk to somebody who is the survivor of sexual violence and how to do that in a sensitive way that, you know, affirms that you believe the survivor and all of that important information. So I would highly recommend that if we're going to create a culture of consent, all our staff get consent training and all our staff are trained in how to respond to a student who might come forward. When it comes to prevention, I think in addition to ensuring that all of our staff are trained, and I really love that we're also working with student groups, I think we also have to ensure that our buildings are safe. And by that, I mean making sure that areas other than, you know, places where you really don't want a security camera are covered by security cameras, you know, in particular stairwells, any place where a sexual assault might be able to happen. We need to make sure, you know, there are cameras in place. I think we need to make sure that we're saving security footage so that if somebody comes forward, you know, a while after an assault takes place, which is pretty normal, it's hard to report a sexual assault and there could be a delay. We haven't like erased the security footage. And I think the work that we're doing in our high schools right now to ensure that students are going to class and not wandering in the hallways during class time is a good step forward to helping ensure that we have safe buildings. And finally, I think we need to, I could use more clarification about the BEP and specifically how the BEP is addressing verbal assault, and particularly in a time when, as you pointed out, sexual assault or harassment, you know, particularly harassment, could be happening on MMSD-owned email or an MMSD Zoom account, and it's verbal. My understanding of the BEP is there's really nothing in there that directly addresses verbal sexual assault, so I'm kind of wondering what part of the BEP that would fall under and how we're educating kids about verbal sexual assault so that it doesn't happen. And finally, I'm just wondering if we can see the detailed response guidance for sexual violence that you're providing to staff. Thanks.
Gina and Lisa.
Yeah, so I know Bryn's about to talk about some of the behavior education plan stuff. I know Bryn had created a whole document around the behavior education plan and virtual learning. I don't know if I don't think she's necessarily going to touch on that, but I do know that is available. As far as the detailed guidance, I think that's a question for Lisa and Jay. We were at this point, it's a guidance for administrators, so I would be open to what they think there.
Thank you, Gina. Lisa, could you Gina, Lisa or Jay? Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
I actually, Jay, where is that detailed guidance housed?
Hey, everyone. That detailed guidance is just something that we hold in Google Drive that we would have shared with principals during or through the principal bulletin. It's not a public facing document, and that it's detailed procedural guidance on how we'd like them to respond. And I believe it also includes phone numbers of district staff that they should report to and specific procedure there. And so
are there parts of the document that can be shared internally to us?
Yeah, Lisa and I can for sure discuss that. We'll review it and then figure out what level of that we could release to the board for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, Chris. And then I have Ali and Savian and Gloria.
Yeah, so first I want to thank you all so much for your work. It's really important work. I also want to point out that MMSD had trans inclusionary policy and gender expansive inclusionary policy long before the Obama administration. So we've been committed to supporting students outside of the binary for a really long time. We're the second school district in the state that passed a trans inclusionary policy. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about Title IX. The other thing is that school districts have tried across Wisconsin to infringe upon the rights of young people who identify as trans. Several young people have sued their school district. Ash Whitaker won a really important case at the 7th Circuit that said basically he had the right to use the facilities that aligned with his gender identity. So I think there is legal precedent for supporting all of our students and allowing for all of our students to navigate their bodies in dignity. I have a few questions, but I want to speak to your question first. So the question, how does the board work with you all to do this work? Every time we have this conversation, it becomes more apparent to me that the board needs to do training around the language of consent and around what's developmentally appropriate when talking about consent. I agree with Chris, refusal is a complicated thing to do. You cannot have consent with the absence of refusal. If you do not have the right to refuse or the skills to refuse, you can't have consent. Simultaneously, we can't just teach consent as if young people are going to be assaulted. We also have to teach consent as if young people may be perpetrators. And so as important as it is to be able to say no, it's also very important to be able to listen when somebody says no. The other thing about that is that developmentally, you don't want students to think that if they didn't say no, that it's consent, or that if they did want to play the game, that is consent, because you can't give consent as a child. Consent is developmentally appropriate. And so driving home the idea that certain touch is inappropriate for a child is a necessary conversation to have and an expansive conversation to have. I think the board has to take responsibility for having a greater understanding of consent, and being able to champion and support the really important work that you all are doing. One of my first questions is for you, Eric. So you talked about, I'm sorry. Actually, my question is going to be about mandatory reporting. The title mandatory reporting suggests it is not an option not to report. What happens if someone does not report? If we're made aware that a member of the staff had information about an assault that took place and did not report it, what happens?
If we, I mean, Jay, did you want to take that or do you want me to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think typically if a principal or a district staff member becomes aware that a staff member didn't do something that they should have done in policy, we typically consult with legal services and then with human resources to determine what happened through investigation and then figure out if there's any sort of staff discipline that's needed there.
Okay, there was a little bit of emphasis on sexual assault that happens on campus. And I am curious how that translates to field trips or off-campus events.
I would say that when it's a school sponsored situation, then it would be the same as if it was on campus. So a field trip or a football game or anything like that. I think that would all constitute the on campus. And again, Bryn might have more, be able to share more about that specifically around the BEP implications. But then as far as off-campus stuff, it really does depend on how we often get information is because students, something's happened to them and they trust the staff in their buildings and they come to them and tell them that something happened. You know, maybe it was in the summer or at a party last weekend or something like that. And in those cases, even though it is also very important that we assess safety immediately and that we take the next steps for supporting the student and really want the student to be the one in the driver's seat here to, like, you know, make sure that they're feeling okay with what they've just disclosed and what the next steps are. But we don't necessarily have the same imminent need if someone just comes to us and says, I was just assaulted in the bathroom just 5 minutes ago, you know. So on campus happening very recently has a little bit of different you know, immediate need versus a student comes and discloses something that might have happened to them previously.
My next question is, you all did not speak to the generation of nude imagery or pornographic imagery as something to report, whether or not that imagery is being exchanged between a student and another student or a student and adult. How do we monitor that activity, report that activity, advise students or prepare students to engage with support if something like that becomes a problem?
I can try to take that one. The BEP does cover viewing pornographic material, and I don't know if Bryn wants to touch on that at all, but certainly I think if a school team becomes aware that that's a pattern for a student, they would provide necessary interventions working with that student and family. In terms of you know, and certainly in this day and age and with students' use of social media, it's also not inconceivable that a nude or inappropriate image of a student might be shared on social media that could then absolutely be determined harassment, in which case we would follow our same usual protocol in terms of reporting, investigating, and then protecting the victim in that case. Applying the BEP where we have jurisdiction, but applying Title IX in all circumstances where we believe that discrimination has happened.
I have two more questions. So my next question is, we talk a lot about reporting, or if a student comes forward to talk about sexual assault, what do we do if a student shows signs of sexual assault in terms of behavior or injury or chronic discomfort? How do we support staff in noticing that and taking action to address indicators of sexual assault that are not a child reporting?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's definitely something that does happen, as you know, especially for our younger students that don't, you know, they don't necessarily have the language to discuss what might be happening to them. It's really important that you have staff that are trained in knowing some signs and symptoms. A lot of times that is when social workers or school psychologists bring in the nurse or ask for our student services team as a whole to discuss what might be going on for a student. And it's always important for us to be, you know, involving family when we can. So really trying to understand what might be going on for the student, what might be, you know, how can we connect with not just the student and what might be going on for the student, but what might be, how might we be able to support the family as well, not necessarily making any assumptions or anything, but just really trying to get a good understanding of what's happening. especially if the student just isn't able to verbally express why they're feeling or, having, or, might be having some indicators that something else is going on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer. My last question is, how are we utilizing the EROs, Safe Harbor, as folks who specialize in working around sexual assault, and particularly sexual assault of children, and how frequently are we mandatory reporting? The other thing is, yeah, I guess that's where I'll stop. So how are we including EROs? How are we including Safe Harbor? And how frequently are we seeing people come forward and report abuse?
I mean, at the high school level, if a student is comfortable and does want to talk with an SRO about what might have happened, a lot of times that's a really great opportunity for a student who, maybe doesn't want to disclose something to a police officer, but knows the SRO in the building and can at least, start with that connection. So we utilize SROs in that way, but again, really wanting the student who's coming forward to be the driver of that. As far as Safe Harbor, we definitely work very closely with Safe Harbor. We've even tried to increase the connection we have between Safe Harbor and our school social workers, because a lot of times if something happens and law enforcement's involved and CPS is involved and we aren't involved as school staff, we might not know that a Safe Harbor interview has happened or has been scheduled. And so then a student comes back and says to their school social worker, hey, I just had this interview. And so we have been working a lot with Safe Harbor on obviously abiding by confidentiality and those constraints, but also informing each other of students that we might be sharing that are involved in this process. One, so that students aren't having to share their story over and over again. And two, so that we're collaborating around best ways to support the student after the Safe Harbor interview.
Thank you so much. Can you speak to
Go
how
ahead.
many mandatory reports we received or are receiving regularly?
I would have to get that data from CPS. We have a way that we document it, but we don't I haven't gotten the updated data. So I can definitely look at our data and then I can ask CPS for theirs and we can look at both.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate that.
Thank you, Ali. I had the same question, and Savian, I'm coming to you, and to you, Anika, next. I am wondering if the board can get a report on this year's numbers on the reporting, mandated reporting, and then some coding of what was the reporting thematically, the best our ability, and similar to also Title IX reporting too. I'm specifically curious because I think this year is going to be a really outlier year in regards to our numbers. So I think it'd be an interesting piece of information for us to ground ourselves into in regards to a baseline moving forward. Savian and then Anika.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Gloria. Savian and Gloria and then Anika, and then Nikki.
Yeah, I feel fortunate and lucky to be able to serve alongside and another host of topics. So I do have 3 questions. Number 1.
Savian, you're breaking up a little bit. Do you mind just, do you want to just turn off your video and then ask your questions, and then when you're done with your video, you put it back on just so we can hear your question entirely?
Yeah, so my first question out of 3 is, can you talk about the work we're doing specifically with young men and boys about the issue of consent? There are a lot of images of a healthy or unhealthy masculinity that we have to be aware of. And, you know, our problems with sexual assault are not for a lack of victims' ability to offer refusal, but with perpetrators not about what we're doing to specifically teach boys about consent.
Savion, I don't know that I'm the best position to answer this, but I know that there's a boys group at La Follette that's doing quite a bit of work in this area, and making sure that that group of young men is providing some leadership to drive the school culture there. I also know that there's been quite a bit of consultation with days, working with coaches, and then coaches working with their athletic teams, making sure that they're also using our extracurriculars as places where we're reinforcing the types of culture and climate that we want to create. But if others wanted to jump in, I'm just aware of those two very clear examples of work that we're doing proactively with young men.
Thank you. I did have the opportunity to visit the group at La Follette. I think that's great work. To answer the earlier question about what the board can do to work with, I think that's something that I'm certainly interested in helping out with further. My second question is particularly about the downstream effects. Are we providing any training of early signs for human trafficking? I know that a lot of data and research, especially out of Dane County, has shown that victims of human trafficking, that starts oftentimes at the high school level. Are there any Title IX implications?
Eric, you could talk about, I mean, I could talk about human trafficking and MMSD, but if you have specifics around Title IX, no, you don't.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No, I don't.
We have a human trafficking committee that we've had going for the last few years. It's made up of nurses, social workers, legal services, and safety and security. And that group has met to talk about different ways that we can, you know, kind of, there's 3 different ways to support students around human trafficking. You know, one is prevention, early intervention, like lots of teaching and helping kids understand what it is, because a lot of times it's very confusing what it is. And then helping students that are in fact, you know, at risk or who are being trafficked. And then third would be to more on like a policy or a larger systems approach. What kinds of bigger systems level things are we doing to reduce the likelihood that that's going to be continuing to happen in Wisconsin, specifically in Dane County. So a couple of things that we have done, Ashley Riley and I have looked at a few curriculums that DPI has vetted and approved around human trafficking that could be available for health classes at the high school and middle school level. We also have a partnership with Dane County's Neighborhood Intervention Program. There is a person, I was going to say social worker, but she's not a social worker. She's a youth worker. She is part of an MOA that she works with our students that are either at risk of or are being trafficked. She also is a great resource because she's a school official, but she doesn't have, she's an employee by Dane County. So there's an option for her to really support students without necessarily needing for students to have any kind of break of confidentiality or have anybody kind of know their business. So she really comes from a really great, like almost like a peer support style where she's really assessing safety, making sure that the students that she's working with are okay, and then making sure that they feel safe and that their confidentiality is protected. So it's a really great program.
Thank you. Yeah, especially in Dane County where the population is so transient, at least folks at risk for being victims of human trafficking, the issue is multi-jurisdictional. So the district is stepping up there. And are we able to provide like mental health and other healthcare types of resources that we can offer for victims?
Yeah. Thank you, Savion, and then Gloria, and then Anika, and then we're going to move into the BAP conversation. I want to make sure, and Chris Gomez-Schmidt. and then we're gonna move into the BAP conversation. Gloria, you muted.
Mine is just in response to the question of how the board can assist. And I think, it's our responsibility to ensure that policy matches practice and practice manages policy, right? It matches. And I think our role as a board is really looking at, our policies around this and around the practice of investigations and the process and all that. And I just want to ensure that, during incident reviews, that I'm sure we're doing incident reviews after each situation, that we are documenting trends and situations and ensure that our policies surrounding that match, right? And so it is not necessarily if you have an answer to this question, that's great, but it is evaluating our practice around how we respond to these incidents, matching our policies. And, things are happening and changing quickly in this area, right? With technology, with the way assaults happen, we have to really be on top of this to ensure that we are, overseeing our policies around this. So if you have an answer, I mean, I think,
Yeah. It's a great question, Gloria. Jay or Lisa?
Yeah, Gloria, thank you. I agree. That's a great question. I think I would summarize that as our way of working, that we're constantly trying to review, especially complex situations, making sure that we're doing a formal after action review. And then certainly when we notice any trends, then we would either adjust our guidance or adjust any of our guidance documents. If need be, we would actually come back to the board and ask for a policy adjustment. I think actually, some of the BEP policy recommendations we're making tonight are reflecting on a year's worth of action and where we feel like the policy doesn't quite fit the way that we believe we should be responding. And so I think that's just maybe an example of that, but certainly in this area, it's complex work. I'll also add, we spent much of last spring working in a very interdisciplinary way. I mean, even tonight you're hearing Eric from Legal Services and Ashley from Curriculum and Instruction. We certainly also worked with the Communications Department, Human Resources, and then even within our own Department of Student and Staff Support. It's very complex. There are a number of board policies that are in play with this work. There are a number of community partners and agencies that are in play with this work. And it's just certainly complex. And we want nothing more than to get it right, and kind of reflecting on everything that that we've dealt with to make sure that we've learned everything we can from them, I think is critical. And just wanted to share that from my perspective, we're prioritizing that work.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Anika?
I was wondering if you could speak to the ways in which the larger student body is informed about what a mandated reporter is, who they are, as well as their Title IX liaisons, especially for students just entering high school or MMSD.
So I can take the Title IX liaison piece of that. So we're working through that, and we did give information to those that were identified as Title IX liaisons, that information they can put outside their office, that they can make students aware. There's a freshman day that I think a lot of the high schools at least do, and they talk about it a little bit, but it's a great place where we have to do some more work to make sure all students are aware of who their liaison is. And one of the challenges, even in normal circumstances, is depending as when staff transfer or get different jobs in the district, there might be someone who's one this year and then a new one the next year and a new one the following year. So we're still working through that, but those are some of the steps that we're taking, and we're also aware of it. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Eric. Anika, do you have any more questions? And Christina, before I go to you, I'm realizing that I may have cut either Savian or Jay question regarding mental health supports?
Yeah, I'll jump back in. Savion, I heard
I'm
you.
really sorry. I'm
No, I
trying to
heard you.
make sure that I'm seeing everybody and I'm managing and I'm taking notes.
No,
So
I wrote it down.
ahead, Jim.
So absolutely, whether it's something that happened on campus or off campus, taking care of the victim is most critical to us. And certainly the layers of support that we'd wrap around that student include mental health resources as needed. That could come directly from our own student support staff, or it could also come from consult with any of our community agencies, including Rape Crisis Center, for example. And all of that would be trauma-informed mental health support.
Thank you, Jay. This is what it is to be a mother and chairing the meeting and doggy and teenager. Okay, Christina, let's do it. Last question, and then we'll move into BAP.
Yeah, my questions sort of my main one builds off of what Gloria asked about how the policies and practices fit together and trying to figure that out. I was looking at the board policies and board docs, and it seems like there's like 5 to 8 different board policies that cover some element of harassment, inappropriate behavior, or violence. So, you know, there's the Student Bill of Rights, there's a safety policy, there's a classroom code of conduct, there's an anti-bullying policy, we have a non-discrimination of students policy. So it seems like there's a lot of pieces policy-wise that affect, and Jay talked to that a little bit. But I'm sort of wondering too, in the presentation, there's a lot of different words that sort of go between a plan, a practice, a procedure, a protocol, guidance that's offered to staff. And I'm sort of wondering, is there a way to easily show how those pieces sort of fit together and flow together, and how we provide consistent either expectations or guidance to staff? For example, the Preventing and Responding to Sexual Violence in Schools document says that all schools teams are provided with a detailed response guidance for a wide variety of incidents. So I guess I'm curious if there's a flow chart or something that shows how all of these pieces sort of fit together.
That's a really good question, Christina.
Can I jump in there? It's a very good question. And it's something that we've actually had on our mind pretty much all year since the beginning of the year. And Sherry, and I know some other board members have been looking at, I mean, we really need to take an overall look at our policies. And what happens is we do them as they come up date-wise, and then sort of after a while, we haven't really gotten that good alignment. So I think it's a very good point to bring up, and something that that we are aware of and want to work on. And Sherry, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, or Gloria.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need as a board, right? I mean, I don't want to get into that discussion now, but I really think that as a board, we have to figure out a way to review and update our policies. And we are talking about different ways of doing that. Everybody here are very busy people. And I know we just don't have, we need some help and to review and bring those policies up to date. And I think that's a conversation for another day, but this is one of them, right? I mean, we can't afford to wait to look at a policy after the fact. And I think we have to stay on top of these policies. And that's the role of the board.
Great, and I do think it's a larger discussions that we probably don't want to get into tonight, but.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And then the reality is that like we need like a dedicated, like we can have like a full-time person just looking at our policies and then making recommendations, and then Nikki and I sit on a policy committee. I think part of your question, Christina, was also in regards to how like those multiple docs talk to each other, and then how staff interpret 5 different documents around the thing, and then the implementation part of it, which I think is important. Do you feel is there anything else that needs to be added from that implementation component?
Ananda, I'll take that one. Chris, I think you're absolutely right that what we're trying to do in central office leadership is make sure that we are fully informed of board policies, recommend edits to those policies if need be, but also then translating that into effective guidance to make sure that our schools are implementing those. Certainly, we can't expect all of our school staff to be fully aware of any subtle language changes to policy. And so what we're trying to do is streamline that into an efficient, could be a slide deck, could be a flow chart, could be guidance documents. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to understand exactly how we want them to respond to certain situations. And at all turns, we also advise them to consult with central office so that those of us that are more aware of the detailed language of policy and the detailed language of our recommendations and guidance documents, we want to consult with them, and that's our job as central office to support. So trying to break things down and make it as simple as possible for our school teams to handle things the right way is what we're trying to achieve. But it's complex, and I think we're doing a pretty decent job. But certainly having a conversation about streamlining district policy is something that I think would be helpful.
If I could just add real quick, all of us have presented here together tonight. This is not the first time we've met. We know there's a challenge with a lot of different policies and the schools might reach out to each other. So we talk to each other all the time. And so we're clear on how we work with each other and who's supporting which policies. So we talk to each other with different things that come up, and then we go back to the school so they're getting like one message and who to talk to during specific questions, working with the policies that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to make clear that I think the guidance and the protocols and what you're using is much more cohesive than our policies look. And so that's where I'm trying to understand better where that guidance and those protocols live, so that I, as a board member, can understand what the schools are actually using. If it is bits and pieces of policies, where are the significant guidance documents that are guiding the actual important work that's happening at the schools?
Thank you, Chris. Let's move. Thank you, Eric. And thank you so much to Ashley and Gina. I was looking for you, Gina, on my screen for the presentation. And let's move into BAP, because I know people are going to have questions about that too. And Bryn did a fantastic job and with the presentation. I want to make sure that we get to that. And I know it's getting a little late, and I want to make sure that our brains are as fresh as we can to have this conversation. And just so you know, I think what I'm going to try to do as far as facilitating the next part of it is I'm just going to call people on my screen, so that reduces my having to be attentive to what people are saying, and also making sure that I call everybody. So everybody's going to get a turn based on how you show up on my screen. And Nikki, you're going to go first. And so Bryn, whenever you are ready, just take it on.
Thank you so much. And I'm gonna let Jay do a super quick big intro, and then I'll dive into the slides.
Sounds great. And Barbara, Lisa, I think it would be great if you could just pull those slides up. But after we just click through those couple slides, then it would be great if you could also pull up the red line document of proposed changes. So those of you who were on the board last year know that we had a very formal year-long process to completely revise the behavior education plan, significantly changing the entire front half of the document, shortening it, making it more user-friendly, and making some adjustments as well to the grid or the actual language of the behaviors and the response levels. Prior to that, in this year, it had been more of an annual process after reflecting, hearing from stakeholders throughout the year, and after kind of looking at trends where certain things seem to be happening more frequently and noticing where the language doesn't quite match, we would come to the board in April or May to then make a couple of subtle policy revisions specifically to the language in that response grid around the way that behaviors are described, defined, or the response levels. And so Bryn will talk you through those couple of change recommendations tonight.
Great, thanks. And also just wanting to set it up as this is a narrow proposal that we have in front of you about specifically written changes to the policy. So you know, earlier in the year, we had our presentation on BEP implementation in general to you all and had a great discussion, and we look forward to, you know, further discussions on BEP implementation. I think we all probably agree that's where a lot of the most important work goes on. And then we also want to make sure that the written policy is still up to date and current with what the board wants and what the board intended when you all passed the last version of it. So our limited revisions are really just, we really try to just focus on those things that where we felt like either the language in the policy just needed a little updating, just to be current with what's going on. So like vaping is an example of that. And then just a couple other changes to sort of so that the policy is accurately reflecting and able to respond to the situations that arise in schools. So these, and also I just had to do super quick, these, hopefully everybody recognizes, are the guiding principles of the BEP. And we are always, always, always referring back to these, discussing these with school teams, looking at how is what we're doing in schools and as a district tying back to these guiding principles. So I just want to remember that broader framework as we right now just focus in on a few written policy changes. So just the background quickly, the context, as you all know, there's been a significant amount of input gathered over the years related to the BEP. There's a very long list of links there on the BEP webpage, which I do look back at regularly. We all look back at. There's a lot of great information there that's been gathered over time, which includes input that informs what we do, not only with guidance, but also what we think about in terms of what written changes are needed. So, and then as Jay mentioned, the really in-depth process last year, I think yielded really great results, a very user-friendly document. By and large, that's been, it's been working well, that revision, and has been clear to school teams, and I think generally clear to students and families. So we are just offering some tweaks this year. The tweaks that we're offering are based on input from throughout this school year, as well as looking back. Oh, sorry, I just missed maybe the last, do you mind going back to the last slide just for one quick second? Thank you. So yeah, we've gathered virtually, I just wanted to mention that just in the last 3 weeks, we've gathered a lot of input on these specific changes virtually from many, many, many school teams, focusing in on those mobile response teams. So schools who are, the folks in schools who are regularly responding to behavior, delivering those interventions, reflecting on practice. So this is really informed by schools, and we also got a lot of great information from schools that informs what we want to do with guidance going into next year. And the few revisions generally pertain to the secondary level. So now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is all that we're talking about here. And I will ask you to pull up the specific revisions, and I will literally just walk you all through them. I think we might as well just jump into those. Perfect. All right, so hopefully this is helpful. It sort of looks like more than it really is because we included everything in the alcohol, drugs, and tobacco section, even the things we weren't changing, just so you can see the whole section in context. But what we're proposing for your consideration is breaking out possession and use of a electronic smoking device. So that would be a vape or vaping device. There's an asterisk there because we are proposing also adding a definition for that term. That definition is taken from a model policy that defines what electronic smoking devices are. And what we heard from school teams, first of all, and what we feel very strongly in Department of Student Staff Support, this is still an issue that we want to address as a public health issue. It also does fall under the behavior education plan, and we want to make sure that it's progressing in a way that makes sense, given that vaping has become so much more prevalent in schools across the country. We regularly collaborate within our department, our Assistant Director of Health Services, Sally, Armando, Ashley, and I have regular meetings to talk about how are we addressing these issues collaboratively. So the most important thing here with vaping is to address it from a public health perspective and to make sure that we have really strong guidance for our schools in terms of how they intervene. What we're proposing for the progression with vaping in the BEP is, and I'm actually, if we can scroll down to the proposed secondary, that would probably be the most helpful. This is by and large where this behavior comes up. And in secondary, a level 3, right, is the first level where it could lead to an out-of-school suspension. So what we're proposing with vaping is that possession of a vaping device stay where it is now, which is at a level 2. It does not progress to a level 3. Use of a vaping device at school, this is the change, is that it would now progress to a level 3. But we would add this behavior as one of the behaviors falling under alternatives to suspension, where schools are required to develop a plan that they will offer anytime that behavior rises to a level 3. So ideally, this will not lead to more out-of-school suspensions. They will offer an alternative to suspension if the behavior is repeated. And so that's sort of why that falls there. I'm sure people have questions, so maybe do we want to pause after each behavior? I'll run through all of them and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, just because it's late,
Yeah.
Brendan, I want to make sure. So I've been already directing folks to just write questions and then make sure that you're putting a reference to where is the question, so then we can go back to. But yeah, thank you for that. But I just a little worried about how long.
I know. Okay, I'll try to hustle. And then where you can see where marijuana is highlighted down below there, that's just highlighted because that's a change. We took out possession of any marijuana paraphernalia because it was listed also in the behavior right above. So it shouldn't be listed under 2 behaviors. That's almost more of a editing revision there. It's not, it won't change anything substantively. It'll just make it clearer. Okay, we can go down to the next category of behaviors. And this one I'm going to go past really quickly. In the proposed elementary, you can just see there's a line added for 4th and 5th grade. And this does get back to the question of how our, I think Chris had asked about verbal sexual assault, or how our verbal comments that might arise to a disturbing level in terms of the types of comments that are being made. This is where inappropriate language is captured in the BEP. And so there's verbal, written, nonverbal threats, or written verbal put downs, and those progress for 4th and 5th grade. Those can progress to a level 3 there. In elementary, that's a different response level. So that's also important to understand. And then it's a lower, it doesn't necessarily lead to any out-of-school suspension. But we had needed to add another line here under swearing, cursing, or making obscene, etc. For 4th and 5th graders, that should also progress to a level 3, just like the verbal, written put downs. So that's another fix. And then the language around serious threats is really just a clarification. The way it was phrased, it made some people confused, thinking that it had to be a threat made over social media. But really the phrasing is just, it's serious threats, including those made over social media that impact the school environment. So that's another sort of cleanup. We can go to the next section. And so this is the last of the behavior changes, and this I want to make sure to go over. So this is, instead of having one behavior that's described as use of physical force against staff, it's breaking it out into 2 behaviors. So right now we have one that is a level 4 or 5, that's use of force against staff. We are proposing, and actually let's go down to the secondary as well. Oh, it didn't make it. Oh, yeah, sorry, it's right there. I'm sorry, it's right there. Proposed secondary, thank you. So having 2 there, 1 that progresses from a level 3 to a 4 that's defined as incidental contact. So the sort of most standard example of that would be, I'm in a fight with another student, a staff person comes in to break it up. As we're sort of dispersing, I'm still kind of maybe trying to get in one last hit at the other student, and I end up making contact with the staff person. Then we would have separately defined a physical attack against a staff member, which would start directly at a level 5. And I think the thing that's important to point out about differentiating these two is we think it's more supportive of both students and of staff, in terms of not lumping the wide range of behaviors that could fall under this into a level 4 or 5, but allowing it to be broken out and more accurately capture what's going on there and the difference between the types of force against staff that can occur at school. Now I'll just go over the last few little bullets and then I'll take questions. So you can see alternatives to suspension. That's something I've had the pleasure of presenting to you all about a couple times. That's been a really promising practice that we've seen this year. We've seen great uses of it. We're over 200 total uses before we went to virtual learning. So that's a really promising practice. We are proposing expanding the use of alternative suspension. So if the change to the vaping levels passes, if you all vote to make that change, then we would propose also including that behavior under the list of required alternative suspension. We would also suggest adding a couple more under the list of behaviors where schools are encouraged to develop. So specifically calling out making recordings of fights, because we did have a number of schools choose to offer alternatives for fights. And so they also want to be able or encouraged to offer alternatives for people recording fights. And then the incidental contact of against staff, that could be another behavior where schools might choose to, they wouldn't have to, but they could choose to. And we also wanted to put in any other behaviors. We feel like we're at the point where schools are getting the hang of this and they're liking the option of adopting alternative suspension, and we'd like to open that up so that they could choose to offer it for other behaviors. Oh, sorry, the definition of distributing drugs is also a clean up one. It had the word sharing in addition to selling or giving away, and sharing was really confusing people in terms of how broad does that go. We know students cannot selling drugs at school, or giving away drugs is still a level 5, but the word sharing was really tripping people up and making people worried about certain, it was catching certain behaviors if a student was using a very small amount of a drug, say marijuana at school, with a friend, that was getting caught up in the same level as selling drugs at school. Okay.
Thank you, Brent. No, thank you, Brent.
So much.
I was hoping that, Barb, can you stop the sharing screen so I can see everybody? And Nikki, you're gonna go first.
Yep.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Brent, for all the work and revising that for us. And I really appreciate the split screen document that shows extremely well, like what parts are you recommending to us. I will start out by saying, like, I have this love and hate relationship with the BAP, because the BAP came as a much needed response to addressing zero tolerance policies. But every time I see it coming up for us, it feels that we're trying to capture every single human behavior. And, you know, we know that is technically impossible. So I would love to hear from my colleagues where folks are at in regards to just overall revising of the BAP and recommendations. So Nikki, take it on, and then Chris Caruzzi.
I'll go with my question. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'll go with my question first and then answer yours, Ananda. On the videotaping fights, Wisconsin statute 968.31 states as a one-party state that in Wisconsin, you are legally allowed to record a conversation, you are a contributor, or with prior consent from one of the involved parties, barring any criminal intentions, which means that legally they're allowed to tape, otherwise it's a First Amendment violation. Additionally, if you see the Alvarez case, which is the Seventh Circuit, involves taping of a police officer, you will find that again, that also would violate the First Amendment rights of the student because they are allowed to tape. Therefore, I am seriously worried on the First Amendment issues because as much as I don't want sharing fights, and I don't like fights to begin with, I don't want a First Amendment suit that the last First Amendment suit on this paid out $850,000 in the city of Boston for taping a police fight.
Thanks, Nikki. Lynn or Jay, either of you are taking this? Yep, I can do that. And yes, obviously our school discipline policy is crafted in compliance with the First Amendment and recognition of students, very important First Amendment rights. So that's why our jurisdiction statement in the BEP applies to, right, any of the behaviors that we're responding to under the BEP. They need to, so in short, the substantial disruption standard, right? So if the student's filming a fight at school and it's substantially disrupting the school, the reason I think why that was largely put in place is the student who records a fight then shares it on social media, and then it leads to more fights, retaliation, and spreads that disruption among the school environment. So it's limited to those situations, and our jurisdiction statement in the BEP covers that.
I'm just worried about a chilling effect on speech because courts have held that anything that has a chilling effect that prevents a behavior that's speech related, courts have found to overturn. And I'm just worried on that situation based on our history and what we've had previously in this city. We're a rights-driven city. We're very politically active. We're very socially active. I think one, optics-wise, and two, legally, I think we're on shaky ground, but that's my opinion. I'd love to hear what my other board members think. As for what I think of the BEP, honest to God, I think the intentions are good. Problem is the implementation. We're still suspending over 61% of the disabled and over 51% of African Americans. So clearly, we still have some work we have to do. I'd love to work on that more than I would change it. I want to change it to address those things first.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Chris Caruzzi and then Christina.
So thank you so much for bringing these changes to our attention. I appreciate the focus on vaping as a public health issue. I'm glad that we're more explicitly looking at that. I was wondering what was the rationale for use of electronic smoking devices being a level 4 at the elementary level and a level 3 at the secondary level. So that's my first question. My second question is around inappropriate language and the conversation we just had about sexual harassment, sexual assault. Specifically, the two pieces of language in there that I think would probably address verbal sexual harassment are making obscene gestures and protected class references. Is protected class references enough to really capture the range of verbal sexual harassment that our students might experience, particularly around gender identity? So those are my two questions.
Thank you. I'll take them in turn. So yeah, that actually, to be honest, threw me off too when I was looking at the changes with vaping. But the thing that's important is that for response level 4 in elementary, it never requires out of school suspension. The language is up to 3 days of out of school suspension for 4th and 5th graders. So we would still be requiring for elementary schools that they always offer an alternative suspension. So it would basically never lead to an out of school suspension. But the level 4 is up to 1 day of in school for any grade. So it's almost equivalent to a level 3, or even with the younger grades, a level 2 at the secondary level. So that's why that progression, it looks steeper, but it's really not in terms of the consequences that come with it. Oh gosh, and then is the language enough to capture like sexual harassment, the types of language that might occur? I will ask if Jay or Eric have comments on that, just because I was not here when that language was first put in place. I'm sure there were discussions about it, and you know, it's always that balance between how much do you spell out in the written policy and how much do you do through guidance. I think your point is a great point, and I've made a note of it in terms of how are we offering really strong guidance to schools around how to implement those, and the range of language that might fall under that behavior.
Thank you, Bryn. I'll just jump in. I'm not sure if Eric wants to add, but this is a conversation that started last year, and it came specifically from MTI, where a number of staff members had reached out because they felt that they had been victims of students using protected class language. And obviously, this is a very good example where we would never capture the full range of terms, slang words that kids were using. And so we felt like the cleaner policy language was to say protected class. But I think the more important is that we help students understand the importance of using respectful language in a school environment and understanding what protected class language refers to, so that they understand, you know, I think critically making sure that our students understand what protected class language is. And so there's a teaching component there for sure.
Thank you, Jay. Chris, are you done? Your question? Yeah, Christina, and then Sadian.
Yeah, I guess one of the confusions that I've had going back to, again, policy or plan is, you know, the behavior education plan is what it's called, but is it really a policy that the board is following? And it looks like a series of 3 policies for elementary, middle school, and high school. And Bryn's nodding, so I'm just gonna say, yes, it's a policy. Okay, gotcha. I guess then, you know, I appreciate the changes that were made, because to me, it does clarify the language, and seems like it would clarify the guidance that we're giving around those things. I guess my question goes maybe to the looking at the data again and when that's going to be available. I know that we were, I think, going to look at the third quarter data, and that didn't happen. I'm just wondering, when we go to the whole year data and compare it to other years, if we can make sure that we're comparing 3 quarters of data and we're not comparing a whole year, because then just to make sure that we have a fair comparison and what we're looking at for numbers.
Thank you. That's a great point. Yeah, and these are all great points and great questions. Jay, I don't know if you want to speak to the BEP data piece, but that is a great point.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that. We're not doing a third quarter report just because of obviously all the uncertainty, and when we ended third quarter, we were not in session. We hadn't yet started virtual learning. Now that we've started virtual learning, it's obviously just been kind of this heavy lift to get everything up and running. We didn't feel that there would be a lot of validity to reporting on third quarter, simply because the last couple of weeks we weren't in session. And if we had done a third quarter report comparing even against the last couple of years of third quarter, we would even have been off by a couple of weeks. And so what I'll work with research accountability and data to do is we'll do a kind of a year to date based on our last day in session. But I also feel that we should look at the full year of data, in that we are still obviously documenting when things are happening during virtual learning. It's just a completely different kind of never seen before type of thing, but we'll try to put together a report that captures accurate comparisons from year to year for up through when we were in session, but also reporting out on things that have happened since then in virtual learning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. And then it just made me think that, like, moving forward, when we are looking at this year data or 3-year data, like how we're gonna take it out this time in history in order so we can continue to look at data in a way that is consistent. So next is Savian and Anika.
Thank you. So I really struggle with this because this is a public health crisis, public health issue, and there's a lot of research and evidence that shows that punitive punishment does not change behavior. It does not get to more desired behavior. And so when we're talking about teens, using vaping and possibly being addicted to vaping, I am really suspicious of the notion that the threat of a suspension in school or out of school will encourage more healthy behavior. So what are we doing for education of vaping as a public health crisis? And how are we educating our students that vaping is not a healthy habit that you want to develop?
I agree with you, and I think that's a great point. It's always hard to figure out how to make the progression in the BEP, appropriately match like the behaviors around it, right? At this point, if vaping does move to where it's proposed, it sort of hits this middle ground between tobacco and marijuana, the way that they progress. And that's obviously, that's something that's come up. You don't always know what is in a vaping device. It can be THC or it can be nicotine. But the important point that you made is how are we addressing it? There are others who are not here who can speak to that better, but I collaborate with Sally Zerbil-Donish, our Assistant Director of Health Services, and her work with the nurses. We've really gotten really well coordinated too in terms of just the guidance that we're giving school teams so that nurses feel really empowered and supported in focusing on that health response, right? And making sure if a student is reported that they're under the influence of at school, that the nurse can support them and check in if they're okay and get them home if they need to get home, or support them at school if they can stay at school. And then the principals or administrators who have to apply the BEP, that they're applying it fairly and that they're really focusing on that intervention piece. So if you are using an in-school suspension, are you using an hour of time to have the student engage with an online module or talk with a school nurse about the public health, about the health effects? Like, I think we can always do more. And I think there's also a lot of great work that I know Sally and the nurses have been doing, and really in my role, it's pointing everybody back to that work. And Armando also, as Assistant Director of Integrated Health, looking if a student is appropriate for something like SBIRT or one of our like motivational interviewing based interventions, where we can use that moment where a student has been caught using a vaping device at school to focus everybody on getting that student connected to a meaningful intervention.
Yeah, because if a 14 or 15-year-old has developed a dependency on nicotine or marijuana, I don't think it's in that person's best health interest to give them a one-day suspension and say, oh, it's been solved.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of, broader school-wide campaigns that I went through. There was the Stop Saying Gay as an Epithet campaign that changed behavior. Stop the and those education strategies that we can use to encourage healthier behavior. And then my last question is, what are some of the challenges we have to scaling or expanding some of the alternatives to discipline?
I think it's part of it is just people getting used to it. And so I think that, we've made huge steps forward this year in terms of it's something people know what you're talking about generally when you refer to it. This is the first year we actually put out this district-wide. So now we have a lot of examples. I think that can be really powerful, right? Of examples where this has really actually helped plug a student into an intervention or connect a student to, a meaningful restorative process or something that will address the underlying behavior. So I think the biggest challenges are, really having just the range of model interventions, but that's work that we're really engaged in our department, especially, and also cross-departmentally. But I think the more like tangible models we can give people that they can just pick up and run with, the more people can just get started, using more alternatives to suspension.
Got it. And then Yeah, and then to answer Ananda's question, I think that's a part of it, is how do we embrace restorative justice district-wide? You know, it's just a way of life.
Thank you so much, Savian. Anika and then Gloria. Sorry, Ellie, you're the last.
I don't think I have any questions or comments.
Oh, okay, thank you. Gloria?
Yeah, so I don't have any questions. I think it's just the thought around the BEP. I think, you know, we have come a long way. I'm glad we're making these changes. I think that, you know, this is where practice really matters. I think that we can sit here and develop these, you know, policies, but I think practice and the involvement of our teachers and staff and our students around this is so important in getting voice in the process, right? And you know, and I agree with everything that's been said around restorative justice practices, and so, and I know we've moved in that direction, right? Is getting feedback from people who are most impacted by these policies, and we're changing, right? It's almost a living document that we're like continually evaluating and changing, and so it's not perfect, but I think, you know, I think it does help our teachers and our staff. The more they are informed and trained around how to respond to these situations, the better. I think that you know, this helps in alleviating the quick response to calling police for everything, right? It is a some guidance around how to deal with behavior that is outside of calling police for every incident or situation. And so I think that's the important thing here, and that's the direction I think that the entire school district and our board wants to move towards.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gloria. Ali?
Bryn, I want to ask a question about a comment you made. So the comment was, you can't tell whether or not a vape is nicotine or another substance. That same idea would be true for a water bottle, right? You can't tell if a water bottle has water or vodka in it, right? So is there a reason why not being able to tell what is contained, whether or not it's an illegal substance or not, is particularly relevant to this conversation? If you can't confirm whether it's illegal or not, we can't act under the presumption that it is, right?
Oh yeah, definitely not. No, I like that point. And we don't want to put schools, and especially not nurses, but really anyone in schools having to test anything, right? We don't want to put schools in that position. So no, I think it's more just about the nature of how much nicotine or how much of any other substance can be delivered into someone's system through a vaping device versus, say, a cigarette.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification, because I think it's relevant to really know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say is I grew up in Madison. I went to East High School. There was a smoker wall at East High School. Students who get in trouble for smoking or ingesting a variety of substance are disproportionately LGBTQ and African American. The behavior education plan replaced the student code of conduct. The number one offense students were suspended for during the student code of conduct was insubordination. It was not a violent offense, and it was not an offense related to drug use. What is the number one offense students are disciplined for under the behavior education plan?
For in school or out of school?
Both.
So I don't have in school off the top of my head. I believe out of school is fighting. But I can check on both of those.
I would greatly appreciate that.
Yeah.
The other thing I am concerned about is when you talk about alternatives to suspension being discretionary. Again, when you get into the racial dynamics, who is more likely to be provided an alternate option is something I think we should be keeping track of. So if students are committing the same offense and getting a different punishment, we need to know why and who. And I think that's something we need to talk about to a great extent. The last question I'm going to ask both you and Jay to speak to, Bryn, is what are the benefits of suspension? Academically, behavior-wise, what is so great about suspension that we just got to keep doing it, and it's a tool in our toolkit because it gets us where?
I'm unmuting. I could go like 4 more hours on that last question. I'm going to answer the first one quickly, which is absolutely. And from my past work in youth justice, we know when we're offering a diversion, we have to make sure that it's offered in the same way that our more punitive offenses are being offered to students. So we've kept this super close eye on that, like almost week to week this year. And the alternative suspension have actually been offered almost exactly the same, but even slightly more to African-American students in proportion to their ratios of out-of-school suspension. So we are seeing alternative suspension as having potential for reducing disproportionality, and it is being offered. Yes, that's such a huge deal, and we're keeping a super close eye on it. And then, oh my gosh, I see it's 8 o'clock. I love your question about suspension. I think we have to have that discussion. Why are we using it, and when we are using it? Why?
Yes, but really what
yeah.
Bryn, what I really want to know is what's good about it. So tell me about the benefits of suspension. Tell me everything that's going great after we suspend kids.
Well, I think, that's a great question. It's a question we should be asking. We should have that discussion. The only times when I've seen where it makes sense to me is where a school team is using it as a break, as a one-day break to pause, do prep work for restorative circles. If we are using it at all, I think we should be using it in that way to get an intervention put in place to take a quick break, to fix things, put things back on the right track. But I'm not gonna, I take your point and hear your question, and I would love to have that discussion, and I will let Jay get a chance to answer it.
Jay, can I get a little more specific with you? Are there academic benefits to suspensions? Do kids come back from suspension and do better in school? Does suspension result in improvement of attendance? All the things that we kind of talk about wanting to see our kids be successful in. How does suspension impact those things, inform those things? What results is our suspensions producing?
It's a great question. I just wanted to point out some of the shifts. So when I was a student at Memorial High School, and then when I first became an assistant principal, prior to the BEP, if I found a student with a cigarette in the parking lot, we sent that student home for the day. And so I think we have continued evidence that we're heading in the right direction. In terms of the actual benefits of suspension, I think if we look at the larger school community, the BEP means that we are now only sending students home for more significant, more disruptive, more dangerous behaviors. In most cases, we have a victim who's involved as well. And I think the schools are at a point now where they're doing everything to mitigate the negative impacts of a student not being at school, by balancing that out with using more thorough intervention when the student comes back from school. I do have some examples of, from my time being an administrator, where a student confessed to me afterwards that until we got to that point where we actually had to call home and send the student home, and the conversation we had when the student came back, that they didn't actually get it or take it seriously. And we did see some change in behavior. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily that we should be using this more and that's the only way we get to change behavior. The other thing that schools are doing is doing almost everything they can to change behavior before we get to that point. But I think in terms of why, as a district, we have a policy that does include out-of-school suspension in certain circumstances as a consequences, recognizing the larger duty we're serving to create safe learning environments.
I greatly appreciate that explanation. It would be really helpful to have data that showed whether or not students who are suspended are more likely to graduate, whether or not suspension impacts students' grades or feelings about their school, just so we get kind of a broader perspective. But I will say, going back to the conversation we were having earlier about sexual assault, that I went to school with somebody who was molested their entire life. And part of the way that they expressed that was through getting into fights and then getting suspended, where they would be trapped at home with the person who was molesting them. And so I think really getting at the root cause of a behavior and really making sure that we're supporting students in ways that are sincerely effective needs to be the priority of the behavior education plan, especially when we are disproportionately disciplining, suspending, referring students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ youth out of the classroom.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali. I wanted to, oh, Jay, did you have something else that you were going to say?
No, I just wrap up by saying that, following our conversation with you all in February, taking a much closer look at out-of-school suspension, talking with kids, talking with families, understanding exactly how that impacts things, and also just recognizing that we now have a lot of experience as a district with virtual learning. Which also means that a day of out-of-school suspension does not need to be a day without learning. It's just layers of complexity, but it's exactly the conversation we need to have.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to that, and also kind of putting this conversation in context of a timeline that, like, potentially this sort of break that we're taking from being in a bricks and mortars can provide a much greater level of creativity and reimagining what does it look like for us to be doing, school and supporting students as they're learning from their mistakes. I just wanted to share a couple of things that I think some of my colleagues highlighted in different words, but for me is when I look at the BAP, it gives sort of this really extensive and intense language around policy and accountability and disciplining. And what we don't have is a grounding document about how we're going to build community, rebuild community, continue to stay in community, and how that is the center value of our ways in which we wanted to engage with our students and our families. And so if we're looking at both documents, right, like there's a mismatch on our values, right? Like, wow, we pay a lot of attention of like how we discipline students. We pay way less attention to how we actually stay in a space of love and compassion for the learning of our students. Also highlighting how, I think some people have mentioned the impact, disproportionate impact of students of color, the disproportionate impact on students with IEPs, extremely disturbing. And I appreciate Jay mentioning like we have come a long ways, and I think the BAP potentially have kind of catapulted us for greater change. We have, I think, 6 years or 7 years of BAP, depending on where you think, whatever the timeline or implementation is, what is next, right? Like, what is, okay, we did that, like, what is the evolution of what is the evolution of holding students accountable for their behavior in a way that they're responding to the community versus your typical status quo discipline approach. And then the other thing, I was wondering, actually, there was a question from Ali in regards to the most common in-school suspension behavior. And I thought I heard in another meeting that was the language around defiance or disruption. Is that correct, Jay, or do you need to get back to us?
We just want to confirm.
Okay.
I do believe that it was in the February presentation, but we'll go back and look and
Okay.
share that with you.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to add one more language to sort of how we can creatively move, and I'm really grateful to be sitting on a board where there's a thread of sentiment of really wanted to do things differently and wanted to provide a platform for staff to propel this change, right? Like, what does it look like for us to have more, like right now we're in this break where no one is getting suspended. What does it look like to when we get back to the buildings, to translate that into moratoriums and suspensions? What does that even mean when we are really reimagining what that looks like? So I want to just to get Lisa back for any final words, and then we're just gonna, if there's no more questions, for us to close our meeting for tonight.
Thanks, Ananda, and thanks to the team for presenting. I do believe we will have an end of the year, as Jay said, BEP report for the board, as we have always done for you, that will do point in time comparison data to point in time. So people will have that they can take a look at by the end of the year, as we've specified, and just appreciate the conversation tonight, feedback, and a chance to collaborate about the work. Really supports all of our learners in schools as well. So thank you, Ananda.
Thank you, Lisa. And there was one more point Nikki had brought up in regards to the recording. And I just reread it, like how it is. And I have been someone that my daughter has shared recording from students at school. I'm just really curious about for us to explore that a little bit more. I think Nikki brought up the sort of the legal compliance issue, but for me, like when recording is part of this generation, right? They record, like we saw like how immediately after school closed, like this surge in TikTok, right? Like, and so now we're saying like, don't record this thing when it's part of it's like drinking water, right? Like you drink water and you're doing a TikTok. There's gazillions of TikToks happening every day in my house, right? And so, how do we translate that into like a document? Now we're saying like, well, don't record it. It's going to be a punishable offense if you record when it is in the DNA and the nature of this generation. And to me, as an educator, I'm thinking too, like, when there is a recording, what is it saying about the student recording that is an important data for me? And also, the data that can be given to school around like what is happening to our students in ways that we wouldn't otherwise not know, right? And so to me, although I don't want to encourage students, never would encourage anyone to record any act of violence, like ever, when those recordings come up, like what they provide to us in regards to an opportunity for us to increase an intervention or address an issue or bring students closer to us. So I hope that gives justice to what my colleague was trying to bring up. And I hope that you all take that under advisement. So it's been a long night. Thank you everyone for the participation, the presentations, and for the attention. And I would like to move a motion to adjourn our meeting.
Second. So moved.
And Gloria, second, and Anika, your advisory vote?
Aye.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carried, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.